Welcome to the second video in this series where I explain the theory underpinning deep brain reorienting. In this video, we will be covering the same three structures of the brainstem and looking at their specific involvement in various types of freeze responses. To recap, we looked at the superior colliculi and their involvement in the orienting reflex, the locus coeruleus with its capacity to initiate shock, and the periaqueductal gray, the generator of emotion and defense. This sequence of activation is important. The superior colliculi are activated first by sensory information. If that information is sufficiently novel or unexpected, there can be a shock response from the locus coeruleus. We hypothesize that this is all activated before the more elaborated affects and defenses: panic, rage, fear, fight, flight, and freeze. Freeze responses are slightly more complicated because they can be part of a periaqueductal gray defense response or involve superior colliculi and locus coeruleus activation. So in this video, we will be looking at the brainstem involvement in these different types of freeze. Let's plot the brainstem activation and its corresponding freeze responses on a timeline. Although plotted in this way, the freeze responses we describe may not be activated in this sequence and may, depending on the type of stimulus, overlap in their activation. As you will remember from the first video in this series, the superior colliculi identify significant changes in visual and somatosensory information. When we encounter something unknown, something not already mapped by our systems, the superior colliculi engage primary orienting responses in the direction of that shift through orienting tension. This facilitates attentional freeze in order to assess the nature of what's happening around us. Is it threatening, or is it something of value to me? Note that the nature of the stimulus has not yet been identified. When something potentially threatening does capture our attention, a threatening look, a loud bang, a sudden movement in the darkness, there can then be what Frank Corrigan calls vigilant rigidity. It is hypothesized that this is shock-induced with involvement of the locus coeruleus. Sensitization of the superior colliculi by the locus coeruleus maintains a hypervigilance to related stimuli and an increase in muscle tone. Other brainstem structures are also involved. As the name suggests, this state is characterized by increased hypervigilance to the environment alongside a whole body rigidity. There is perhaps a sustained bracing against anticipated aftershock, as if the initial shock has sensitized and energized vigilance, and the body is tense in readiness. Defenses mediated by the periaqueductal gray are placed on hold, while the threat's form and imminence are further identified. Heart rate is decreased, while blood pressure is normal or increased. In contrast to vigilant rigidity, the periaqueductal gray is activated in the high arousal freeze response, with a different physiological signature. High arousal freeze is characterized by high sympathetic nervous system arousal. In this state, heart rate is increased and there is a readiness for fight or flight. Specifically, this involves dorsal periaqueductal gray activation, an active state. A passive state would involve the ventral periaqueductal gray, and it involves collapsed immobility. Collapsed immobility is typically presented as a freeze response, so we have included it here. This can be the only survival response left available when all other attempts at fight, flight, and freeze have failed to establish safety from complete entrapment and pain. Collapsed immobility is characterized by hypotonia of the body and a very slow heart rate. But before collapsed immobility is engaged, there is typically another type of freeze response that occurs. You will recall it mentioned in the previous video, where co-activation of the dorsal and ventral portion of the periaqueductal gray occur. This freeze response is called tonic immobility. Tonic immobility includes a rapidly fluctuating heart rate and an inability to move or cry for help. The whole body is rigid. There is a sense of terror and horror. This type of freeze is often reported in cases of physical and/or sexual assault and is activated in animal models by restraint and entrapment. In this state, both the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system are activated. A high arousal freeze response is met by a low arousal freeze response. To summarise, we have outlined 5 different types of freeze responses, each with different brainstem structure activation. Attentional freeze, mediated by the superior colliculi. Vigilant rigidity, initially energized by the shock response from the locus coeruleus. And finally, there are 3 types of freeze associated with periaqueductal grey activation. High arousal freeze with defenses placed on hold, collapsed immobility with loss of body tonicity, and tonic immobility, where both of these active and passive elements are present.